to fund your future with DRS. So, I recently read an article from AARP about why it's so important to talk with your adult children about your finances. These experts say that as we get older, it's especially helpful for your kids to understand how things are set up so that if, something should happen to you, maybe if it was like a car accident, but especially as we're aging, as dementia creeps in, all of these things, to have these conversations now. So to help us explore this, we've invited our coworker, Adam, to the studio today. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
So kind of as like a little setup for this episode, Adam, I had approached you about this idea of talking with adult children, and you're in your 50s with adult children in their 20s. And what was kind of your initial reaction when I brought this up to you?
Well, I thought that was a good idea because we hadn't done that. I come from a family that didn't have money, so there was no talk when I grew up about investments or, what happens if my parents, can't take care of things. There was no thought of any of that because there really wasn't anything to take care of, at that point. So I thought it was a good idea and decided to go ahead and talk to my kids or talk to one of my kids anyway to sort of set her up in case anything ever happened to me and her mom. She'd be able to take over, pay the bills, do all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And had you set up a will or anything like that before this?
So we don't have an actual will, which I'm sure is a terrible thing. We do have a video that we've shared with everyone in our family that basically says what we would like to happen. I know that may not carry legal force and we should have a will, but essentially, our arrangements are pretty simple. Our kids get our things and they share it 50-50. We have 2 kids, so there's not a huge amount there,
Yeah. So we had asked you kind of a few weeks ago to sit down and chat with your kids about some of these points. I also want to mention the article kind of points out 3 big areas that families should focus on. So it's kind of this sharing password access, that you don't necessarily have to give your kids the list now, but it's important that they know where the list is, or at least how to access it with all of these password managers that we have nowadays. The second one is having access to key documents, like where they are and how to access them, like whether it's birth certificates, passports, just key documents like that. And then the third one is kind of how you pay your bills, like if they're paid automatically, if so, from which accounts. So how did the conversation go with your kids? Like, how did you approach it?
So I approached my daughter. We just sat down. I asked her if I could talk to her about it. She said yes. I'm pretty lucky. My youngest is super responsible. She's already saving for retirement and she's 23. She works at a small retail job downtown and she doesn't make a huge amount of money, but since she lives with us, most of her money is discretionary. So she's putting a bunch aside a month because I told her early on, if you could put aside a few $100s a month, you will retire a millionaire. So she's already starting that. But what we did is we sat around the table and first we talked about passwords and password managers and that kind of thing. We wanted to make sure she has our passwords. I have a high degree of trust in my daughter, so I don't mind. I mean, I certainly understand there may be folks who, their kids could do something unusual and you don't want to give your passwords away. That's understandable. But our kid has all of our passwords and that kind of thing. So we use a password manager. But we also, during this conversation, decided that what we were going to do too was download them and put them in a thumb drive and basically have it hidden in our house. So if for some reason that service goes down or streaming goes down or the internet goes down, I still have everything I need in a place locally.
Nice.
When we talked about where our documents are stored, that's pretty easy because we have an old-fashioned system. We've got an old filing cabinet and in our garage, and we stack up the files by year, by type. So when we moved, we got rid of a bunch of old files, but we have files for the last few years. If she really needed to, she could dig through those. But I think most everything is electronic these days in such a way that she probably wouldn't have to for much. And then we also use the same insurance company that we use for our life insurance. We use for our house and our car and everything. So it's sort of a one-stop shop. If anything were to happen to us, she could call the insurance company and they would be able to sort of help with everything she needs.
Nice. And then what about, you kind of mentioned this, maybe it's in your video, like if there's any particular charities that maybe you would want if you passed, that you would want some of your funds to support. Did you talk about that at all?
No. We didn't talk about any charities because we're not in a position, like I would want my kids to have the things that they can have from me. We don't have a large amount of money secreted if we were to pass. So that's not really so much of an issue for us. My kids know what I would give to. So, for example, they might give away one of my guitars to a local school or to a talented musician or something like that. But there's no secret pot of money that they're going to give away to somebody and give them a good time.
But that's an important part of it too, is the
Sure.
assets. Like you said, you have a nice guitar collection,
Mhm.
so that they kind of know where you would wish to have those guitars donated should something happen to you.
For sure. And we've actually even talked before when both of my kids were at the house about just our assets in general so that there wouldn't be any conflict if, when me and my wife are gone, I don't want my kids to bicker over things. And so we just really talked about it. Is there anything any of you really want? And we talked about it and there was nothing that anybody really disagreed about. So it was, I'm hopeful that when the time comes to share our assets, there won't be any griping or complaining among my kids. I highly doubt it. Again, it's not like it's Brewster's Millions, right? It's not like there's $10 million and somebody's going to be really upset because the other person gets the Bentley or anything like that. It's more realistic. And I think probably close to what a lot of folks are going through when they talk to their kids.
Yeah. I think especially when there's siblings involved. I know, Seth, you're not an only child.
No,
You have siblings.
Two younger brothers.
Two younger brothers. Have your parents had any conversations with you about what happens between the three of you?
Yeah, my wife and I went to a meeting with my parents and their financial planner and talked a little bit about this. And part of it was trying to encourage my parents to spend some of the assets they have. They want to give their assets to their kids when they pass away, and trying to help them understand that we don't need them. We're in a position where they should be taking care of themselves. I know it was really important to them in this conversation to make sure everybody gets equal. And I think that's really hard, like Adam, as you were describing with tangible assets. Like, my parents don't have guitars, but if they had, I was thinking like they had a stamp collection or something. Like, how do you, if one person's really into that and the other folks aren't, how do you divvy that up in a way that feels fair to folks? And both my wife and I have had aunts and uncles and grandparents who have passed away over the last few years. And those sorts of things I think are just awkward. Maybe not like a lot of anger or pain around them, but it just, what's the right thing to do? And it can sometimes feel awkward. Like, I can imagine in the situation of your kids, Adam, like maybe both of them are like, we don't want these guitars at all. Like, is it okay to just go sell them? Like what's the right appropriate step? I think it oftentimes becomes a lot of work for whoever's the executor of an estate to sort through all those things. Even when the estate isn't big, it's just trying to figure out, like, what do I do with this stuff now?
You brought up a good point. When my dad's father died, I remember my dad being super exasperated by having to go through all that stuff. His dad hadn't made the plans to go through all that. And so he came back to me immediately and he's like, the first thing I'm doing is going through all my stuff so that you know exactly what you're supposed to do. And we've had those conversations too with my kids. I've told my kids, hey, if that guitar doesn't bring you joy, sell it.
Yeah.
Perfectly fine, And it's even a weirder thing, and I don't know how normal this is, but as I get older, I do think about things like, before I buy this capital thing, is this something that my kids could use, that they would want? Literally, I've fallen in love with a particular sword. I want a sword, right? It's not an expensive sword, but I want a sword. And so I asked my daughter, I go, would you ever want a sword? And she's like, oh, heck yes. This is my daughter who goes to Renaissance fairs and makes her costumes and things like that. She's like, oh, I would love a sword. So that makes me feel a little bit better about if I want to buy this sword, that I know that somebody else will appreciate it after I'm gone.
Yeah. I think what I have seen in family members, as they've helped other family members settle estates and things like that, to me, it always seems like the process is going to take a year just to go through that whole cycle. And I think, as you were saying, for some folks, it can feel like overwhelming at the start and trying to figure out what the plan is and the steps. And, it might be 6 months later and you're like, oh, I have to file taxes now, and like all of these steps. And I think oftentimes it is motivating to, how can I make this as simple as possible for whoever is going to follow me? And my parents have talked about, here's what the safe deposit box is, here's where our checking account is. But I've thought about this in terms of just, your own personal finances. If you're married, like, what do you take care of and what does your spouse take care of? And making sure you have access across those things and at least knowledge of them. That's something that's really important to keep in mind. My wife pays certain bills, I pay certain bills. And how do we keep track of those if something happens to one of us, that the other person, they're already dealing with a lot of things and then trying to, deal with this what feels like kind of technical.
Mm-hmm. And we go through that. My wife tends to pay all the bills. And so this was a good exercise to make sure that I had all the passwords, right? Like I could figure them out, but it's good to have them. And then our situation's also complicated by, and a lot of state workers might have experienced this. There was a vendor for state agencies that let their information out, and a lot of our information was compromised. And so I had to go in and block all of the credit reporting agencies because people were trying to take out credit cards in my name. That's going to be a real hassle for whoever comes next, right? Before you do anything, then you have to go back and unlock all these things and know your password and all those other things that you need. So we hadn't done that in a year or two. And frankly, I had forgotten one of the passwords. So we had to call, not Experian, it was one of the other ones, and go through the whole rigmarole of what I suspect was some kind of LexisNexis oriented security, where they asked me a whole bunch of questions about my family and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the idea about the spouse, because then as I was prepping for this episode, I thought about between my husband and I, I'm the one who manages our finances. And so I went through and wrote out a list of okay, here's where the accounts are. The Roth IRA is with this account, and then the DCP is with this account. And just saying, all the passwords are saved on my phone in a password manager. So having those sort of things, and then printed it out on a list and then stuck it in a file folder, where it's easy to find.
Yeah. The point Adam made earlier about, everything being electronic, I think it makes some things easier, but it's if I get a statement every month or quarter in the mail, it might remind me oh yeah, I forgot I had this investment account, or if my spouse has passed away, oh, that's right, we had this whatever out there. It's hard, and that's, we've talked about this in the past, the Department of Revenue that has the...
Yes, claim your cash.
Yeah, the claim your cash, the lost property sort of thing, and trying to do that. I think that oftentimes happens when people pass away and trying to figure out where these accounts are or what else is out there. Some people have multiple bank accounts and, multiple investment accounts, and trying to track all that down, and sometimes multiple bills.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, you all did that episode where you talked about the unclaimed property, and I had $50 to $100 waiting. That reminds me, I need to go claim that.
Go find it.
I typed in my own name, and it said that, yeah, sure enough, me and at my address and age had some money somewhere. So I need to go figure that out.
Yeah. That'd be a whole separate article. Separate story on Adam.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was one of the other things that the article had mentioned, was talking about reviewing your income sources. And I think this is especially important for folks who are retired, and having those conversations with adult children of saying, okay, I have this pension with the state. I have a Roth IRA. I have this account, this investment account. This is where these are. This is the income that's coming in and where it's coming from.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that this conversation prompted that I keep thinking about is I haven't had this conversation with my parents. The extent of the conversation I've had with my parents was last time I visited my dad, he said, "You're the executor of our estate." That's the extent of financial conversations I think I've ever had. And at the time I said, well, I would encourage you to make my daughter also an executor in case anything ever happens to me. If I were incapacitated and someone needed to make a medical decision about me, if it wasn't my wife, I would want it to be my daughter. So I also think thinking about contingencies, if the person that you have listed isn't available, who should be next is a key thing.
Sure.
I think that's a really good point. I think people oftentimes think about their spouse, but as you age and you're both getting maybe more challenged in being able to make decisions, who else in your life is going to be able to help you with this? I think about with my brothers, I've seen my parents do this with their own siblings, and how they're helping people navigate some of these challenges. What's out there? What accounts do you have available? What sort of guaranteed money do you have? And what are you living off of investments, or what can you expect to be coming in? It's tough to put all of that on the table for somebody.
And it's different for each person. My wife will essentially have one retirement through one agency that she's worked at for a really long time in another state. And I'll have little pieces because my career has been in 10-year chunks at different places. So I'll have a very small private sector retirement, a very small retirement from the state of Oregon, and a very small retirement. Well, who knows how big it'll be from the state of Washington, but it won't be just one check. So we'll have to be tracking all these sources and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And so, Adam, now that you've had this conversation with your children, what is some advice you would give to another parent who wants to have this conversation?
I think the first thing I would say is it's a really good thing for yourself and your spouse to get ready to have this conversation, because it makes sure that you have your ducks in a row. You know where your files are, you know where your passwords are. You've got a list, let's say, or some procedure of what you pay every month. So I think it's good for yourself, if you haven't done that in a while, to do that anyway. For me, it's really easy. Our kid lives with us right now. She's going to school. So it was just a matter of, asking ahead of time, hey, do you mind if we sit down and talk about this? And, it makes her slightly uncomfortable because she doesn't like the idea of thinking about when me and her mom are here, right? Like, that's an uncomfortable conversation and people don't love to have it. But by the same token, it's totally reasonable. She understands why, we need that conversation. And, she saw both of my wife's parents had different levels of dementia and issues like that as they got older. So she experienced that, and we found out about it through my wife's mom paying the same bills several times in a month. That is how they found out that she had Alzheimer's. So it's something that they're aware of. They know it can happen. No one ever thinks anything's going to happen to them, right? But you should be prepared, and it doesn't take much. You can have a nice little conversation. I think maybe 30 minutes, if that, was our conversation. And it was just a good way to say, hey, this is out there. If you need anything, here's how you find help.
I think that's a good approach to it. It's saying that it doesn't have to be this big thing, or you can just take it in chunks to say, hey, start opening up that conversation of, hey, if anything happens to me, the passwords are on a piece of paper in the top drawer or something like that.
Well, and like Seth said, I think even just giving people permission to do what makes them happy if you're not there, so they don't feel some attachment to your things or to, whatever material objects you might give them. Just, for at least for me, I don't, I want them to do what makes them happy. I don't want them to feel like, oh, I got to hang on to that stupid guitar. If they want to sell it, sell it. If they want to wait 10 years and play it, they want to give it to their kid if they have any kids, great. I think that's an important conversation to have too.
It reminds me, I'd forgotten about this until we had this conversation. I think my parents tried to have this conversation with me when I was like in my early 20s. And I was like, I don't want to talk about this. Like, I don't know what any of these words mean that you're saying. I don't really care. And now I'm at a point where I've seen them go through it with other family members. Like, I understand more the importance of it, but it is like, just as you were saying, Jenny, kind of just little chunks. Like, okay, be aware of this. How can we add on to it? When's the right time to talk about it? And when does it feel more real? If your child's buying their first house or moving off on their own, like there might be opportunities to bring that conversation forward. It might not go perfectly the first time, and you just keep, chunking away at it.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
Well, I think it was a good experience that actually helped bring us a little closer. It helped me and my daughter have a real conversation about stuff that's going to happen. And I think it's a good thing to have the conversation both for yourself, for your kid, for your family. I think it's a really good conversation to have because it will ultimately help your family during the most stressful time they're going to have. Work out all that stuff ahead of time as easy as you can. It'll make life easier when it's tough.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it'll still be tough, but it'll be a little bit easier. I think that's a great takeaway.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thanks. I love listening and reading the podcast.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. And now we'd love to hear from you. What topics would you like to hear about? What questions do you have for us? Send an email to drs.podcasts@drs.wa.gov. That's drspodcasts@drs.wa.gov. The Department of Retirement Systems provides this podcast as a public service, but it's neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of DRS policy. References to any specific product or entity do not constitute an endorsement or recommendation. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by DRS employees are those of the employees and do not necessarily reflect the view of DRS or any of its officials.